Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The Climate Central organization regularly engages in fraud, but they've really outdone themselves this time. They're predicting that 150 million people will lose their homes by the year 2050 due to sea level rise, and that nearly 500 million people will lose their homes to sea level rise by the year 2100. They are predicting that the entire region around Bangkok, Thailand will be underwater soon. According to new research conducted by Climate Central, by 2050, sea level rise could push the high tide line above the homes of 150 million people living on coastlines today. Rising sea levels could also push chronic floods higher than land currently home to 300 million people. That number could reach 480 million by 2100. These totals are significantly larger than previous estimates and have wide-ranging and profound implications for economic and political stability. Importantly, the greatest impact will be felt in Asia, where 6 nations, China, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, are home to 75% of the 300 million people who will be living in chronic flood zones. These findings are based on Coastal DEM, a new digital elevation model that uses machine learning methods to correct for systematic errors in the principal elevation dataset previously used for international assessment of coastal flood risks, NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission. Wow, that sounds really sciencey. Who could argue with such sciencey sounding rhetoric? W.C. Fields said, "If you can't dazzle them with your brilliance, baffle them with your bull." Now let's look at what's really going on in Bangkok. This is Bangkok, and this is the region which Climate Central showed was going to drown. It's pretty flat around here, and the average elevation is about 5 meters, or 5,000 millimeters. The NOAA Tides and Currents website shows that there's 2 tide gauges in the Bangkok region. One shows very rapid sea level rise, and the other one shows very little. Let's look first at the one which shows very rapid sea level rise. There was almost no sea level rise there from 1940 until 1960, and then suddenly from 1960 to the year 2000 it started shooting up very rapidly. And at the bottom of the page there's a note. This station has 2 different mean sea level trends due to apparent land subsidence. So there's something going wrong here. From the year 1960 until the year 2000 the land was subsiding very quickly. And here's another more complete graph NOAA has for the same tide gauge. This one shows that over the last 15 years there's been almost no sea level rise at that location. There's obviously something very wrong going on here. Let's take a look at the station and maybe we'll see what's happening. And there's the tide gauge. It's built on fill dirt in a swamp. I guess no one should be too surprised that it sometimes is sinking. This tide gauge is a farce. Let's look at the other one. The other tide gauge shows almost no sea level rise since the year 1940. Less than 1 millimeter per year. Remember what we said at the beginning, that Bangkok is about 5 meters above sea level, or 5,000 millimeters. That means it'll take more than 5,000 years for Bangkok to go underwater. Climate Central says it's going to happen in the year 2050, but it'll be closer to the year 8000. These are some 5,000-year-old artifacts from Thailand. That's about how long it's going to be before Bangkok goes underwater. So Climate Central is predicting about 5 meters of sea level rise by the year 2050. Let's take a look at what it would take for that to happen. These are average winter and summer temperatures in Antarctica in degrees centigrade. The vast majority of Antarctica never gets above freezing. How is the ice going to melt there below freezing? Over the last 5 million years, Antarctica has cooled about 10 degrees centigrade. It's going to be pretty tough to melt all that ice. And pretty much the same story in Greenland. This is a compilation of surface mass balance graphs from the Danish Meteorological Institute. What this graph shows is the difference between the amount of snow which falls on Greenland every year and the amount which melts off the surface. During an average year, nearly 400 billion more tons of snow falls on Greenland than melts off the surface. In 2017, it was a lot higher than that. Greenland's surface gained 540 billion tons of snow, and in 2018 it was 500 billion tons. Last year was a little slower. Greenland only gained 160 billion tons of snow and ice. This doesn't really look much like a meltdown. Now let's look at what's going on at some of Greenland's more famous glaciers. Greenland's Helheim Glacier has grown about a mile since the year 2012. And the Petermann Glacier has grown even more than that over the last 7 years. If Greenland is melting down, it's not occurring very quickly. But that wasn't always the case. 80 years ago, all the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting. Dr. Hans Alman was the leading authority on Greenland glaciers, and he said, "It may without exaggeration be said that these glaciers in Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse." 8 years later, in 1947, Dr. Alman warned that the Arctic had warmed up by 10 degrees Fahrenheit since the year 1900. He said at the present melting rate in the Arctic, oceanic surfaces would rise to catastrophic proportions, and people living in the lowlands along their shores would be inundated. The Arctic change is so serious that I hope an international agency can speedily be formed to study the conditions on a global basis, he added. The only places you could get the water from to drown Bangkok would be from Greenland or Antarctica. But neither of them is melting very fast. That's why the tide gauge shows it's going to be at least 5,000 years before Bangkok goes underwater. Now let's look at what's really going on with this Climate Central report. They're predicting flooding in places like Bangladesh, which used to be called East Pakistan. A search for flooding East Pakistan in the Australian newspaper archives turns up at least 1,281 results. Here's one from 1970. Floods that have engulfed nearly one-third of East Pakistan's total area of 55,000 square miles have caused damage at $178 million. Here's another one from 1954, and at the bottom another one from 1962. The Ebola cyclone in 1970 drowned 300,000 people in Bangladesh. The bottom line is that Climate Central isn't predicting anything meaningful at all. If they get a storm at Bangkok which produces a 5-meter storm surge, it's going to flood. That's the way it's always been, and that's the way it always will be. But it doesn't have anything to do with climate change. They're simply predicting normal weather patterns in Asia. Trying to scare 500 million people with your junk science is pretty heinously bad behavior. But unfortunately, it has become the new normal among climate fraudsters. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.